Sarah Thompson sat in her car outside the Millbrook Police Department, taking a deep breath as she looked at the imposing brick building. Today was her first day as the new police chief, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. At 45 years old, she had worked incredibly hard to get here, spending 20 years climbing through the ranks of law enforcement. But being the first black female police chief in the city's history meant all eyes would be watching her every move. The morning sun was just beginning to rise as she stepped out of her car, her freshly pressed uniform catching the early light. She had arrived an hour early, wanting to set the right example from day one. Her mother had always taught her that being early was being on time, and being on time was being late. Sarah smiled at the memory of her mother's wise words. As she walked through the parking lot, she noticed a few officers arriving for the morning shift. Some nodded politely, while others seemed to look away. Sarah had expected this. Change wasn't easy for everyone, especially in a department that had been run the same way for decades. Inside the building, the smell of coffee and paper filled the air. The front desk sergeant, an older man named Bill Peters, looked up from his computer with surprise. "You're here early, Chief Thompson," he said, standing up to greet her. Sarah appreciated his professional attitude, even if she could sense his uncertainty. "Good morning, Sergeant Peters," she replied with a warm but professional smile. "I believe in starting as we mean to go on. Could you show me to my office?" Her voice was clear and confident, showing no sign of the butterflies in her stomach. As they walked through the hallways, Sarah took mental notes of everything she saw. The bulletin boards needed updating, some equipment looked worn, and the break room they passed could use a good cleaning. But what caught her attention most was the way conversations stopped when she walked by, only to resume in whispers once she passed. Her office was larger than she expected, with windows overlooking the city she had sworn to protect. The walls were bare except for a few certificates left by the previous chief. On the desk sat a stack of files, personnel records, budget reports, and incident summaries that needed immediate attention. Sarah had done her homework before accepting this position. Millbrook PD had its share of problems: low morale, outdated training procedures, and a growing disconnect with the community. But it was the unofficial reports that worried her most: whispers of racial profiling, excessive force complaints that disappeared, and a group of veteran officers who seemed to operate by their own rules. As she settled into her chair, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Captain Michael Rodriguez, her second in command, entered with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this, Chief," he said, placing 1 cup on her desk. "First days can be tough." Sarah appreciated the gesture. During her interview process, Rodriguez had been one of the few senior officers who seemed genuinely supportive of change. "Thank you, Captain," she said, taking a sip. "I've been reviewing the department's statistics. We need to talk about community engagement and training updates." Rodriguez nodded, pulling up a chair. "Some officers won't like changes, Chief, especially Officer Miller and his group. They've been here a long time, doing things their way." Sarah had read Officer James Miller's file multiple times. 15 years on the force, multiple complaints of excessive force and racial bias, but all dismissed under the previous administration. He represented exactly the kind of problem she needed to address. "Change isn't optional, Captain," she said firmly. "This department serves everyone in Millbrook, not just those who look like the old guard. We're going to bring this department into the present, one step at a time." As they discussed plans for her first department-wide meeting, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Through her office windows, she noticed several officers in the parking lot, talking and pointing toward her office. Among them was a tall officer she recognized from photos, James Miller. Sarah straightened her back and returned to her work. She hadn't gotten this far by letting intimidation tactics work on her. She had plans for this department, big plans. Starting with a complete review of all standing procedures and complaints. If some officers didn't like it, they would need to adapt or find another line of work. The morning sun now fully lit her office, casting a warm glow over her desk. Sarah Thompson, Millbrook's new police chief, was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She just didn't know yet how soon those challenges would come. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah Thompson's first day as police chief, and she was already making waves in the department. Tonight, she had decided to do something that no previous chief had done in years: conduct a surprise inspection of the night shift. She believed that real change meant knowing exactly what happened in her department at all hours. At 1:45 a.m., Sarah parked her personal car a block away from the station. She had deliberately chosen to wear civilian clothes, a simple black blazer over a white shirt and dark pants. Her badge hung on a chain around her neck, and her ID was secure in her pocket. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes the best way to see the truth was to blend in. The night was cool and quiet, with only the sound of distant traffic breaking the silence. As she walked toward the station, she noticed how different the place looked at night. The parking lot was half empty, with just a few patrol cars and personal vehicles scattered around. The building's security lights cast long shadows across the pavement. Inside her jacket pocket, her phone was already recording audio. It wasn't that she didn't trust her officers, but trust needed to be verified, especially after what she'd discovered in the past 2 weeks. The complaint files she'd reviewed showed a disturbing pattern of incidents during night shifts, particularly involving Officer Miller's squad. Sarah had spent her days reviewing personnel files and old incident reports. What she found troubled her deeply. There were too many dismissed complaints, too many lost body camera recordings, and too many incidents that seemed to disappear without proper investigation. Most of these problems centered around a group of officers who worked the night shift. As she approached the rear entrance of the station, Sarah noticed something that made her frown. The security camera that should have been monitoring the door was pointed at an odd angle, almost as if it had been deliberately moved. She made a mental note to check the maintenance logs later. The sound of laughter drifted from around the corner, followed by the distinctive click of a lighter. Sarah moved quietly, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the pavement. She turned the corner to find two officers, Johnson and Peters, taking an unauthorized smoke break, their patrol car idling nearby. "Gentlemen," Sarah spoke firmly, making both officers jump. "I believe smoking is only permitted in designated areas." She reached for her badge, but before she could grasp it, a sharp voice cut through the darkness. "Don't move. Hands where I can see them." Sarah froze, recognizing that voice immediately. Officer James Miller emerged from the shadows, his service weapon pointed directly at her chest. The beam of his tactical flashlight blinded her, but she could make out his aggressive stance. "Officer Miller," she said calmly, despite her racing heart. "This is Chief Thompson. Lower your weapon." She kept her hands visible but made no sudden moves. "Sure it is," Miller sneered, taking a step closer. "And I'm the mayor. Let's see some ID, slowly." Sarah could feel the tension crackling in the air. Johnson and Peters stood frozen, cigarettes forgotten, watching the scene unfold. She knew this moment would define her leadership, not just for Miller, but for every officer in the department. "Officer Miller, badge number 6472, she said, her voice steady and clear. "You are currently violating department protocol by pointing your weapon at an identified superior officer. I am reaching for my badge, which is on a chain around my neck." Miller didn't lower his weapon. "How do you know my badge number?" he demanded, the flashlight beam unwavering. "Because, Officer Miller, I am your chief of police, and I make it my business to know my officers." Sarah slowly pulled out her badge, letting it catch the light. "I also make it my business to know when they're breaking protocol." The parking lot fell silent except for the idle hum of the patrol car's engine. Johnson and Peters had backed away, their faces showing a mix of shock and embarrassment. But Miller stood his ground, gun still raised, creating a standoff that would soon become the talk of the entire department. Sarah knew the next few moments would be crucial. Her phone was still recording in her pocket, capturing every word. She had planned for a quiet inspection, but fate had handed her something much more significant. A chance to confront the very problem she had come to fix. The tension in the parking lot could be cut with a knife. Officer Miller's gun remained pointed at Chief Thompson's chest, the tactical light creating harsh shadows across her face. The weight of her phone recording in her pocket felt like a shield, capturing every word of this confrontation. "I'm going to say this one more time, Officer Miller," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of her position. "Lower your weapon. That's a direct order from your chief." She kept her badge visible, the gold shield gleaming under the security lights. Miller's hand tightened on his gun. "Anyone can buy a fake badge," he growled. "For all I know, you're here to case the place." His words carried an ugly undertone that made his real meaning clear. Officers Johnson and Peters shifted uncomfortably behind Miller. They knew their chief's voice, had seen her every day for the past 2 weeks, but neither spoke up. Their silence spoke volumes about the department's culture that Sarah was fighting to change. "Officer Miller," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "In the past 14 days, you've worked 8 night shifts. You arrived late to 3 of them, according to dispatch logs. You filed 6 incident reports, all involving traffic stops of minority drivers, none of which resulted in actual citations." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Would you like me to continue listing the contents of your personnel file?" Miller's expression flickered with uncertainty. A flashlight beam wavered slightly, but his gun remained raised. Anyone could learn those details, he insisted, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Sarah took a calculated risk. "Your daughter Emma just started college at State University. You requested schedule adjustments to attend her orientation 2 months ago. Your wife Susan called the station 3 days ago about changing your emergency contact information." She kept her voice calm, professional. "I know my officers, Miller. All of them. Now lower your weapon before you make the biggest mistake of your career." The sound of running footsteps interrupted the standoff. Sergeant Rodriguez and 2 other officers burst around the corner, responding to a silent alarm Johnson had managed to trigger. They stopped short at the scene before them. "Miller, what the hell are you doing?" Rodriguez shouted, his hand moving to his own weapon. "Stand down, Sergeant," Sarah commanded, never taking her eyes off Miller. Officer Miller was just about to lower his weapon and explain why he drew on his commanding officer without proper cause or identification protocol. Miller's face had gone pale as the reality of his situation sank in. Slowly, finally, he lowered his gun. The flashlight beam dropped to the ground, leaving them in the dim glow of the parking lot lights. "Chief, Miller started, but Sarah cut him off with a raised hand. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, her voice crisp with authority, "please escort Officer Miller inside. I want his weapon, badge, and all department equipment secured immediately. Officer Johnson, Officer Peters, you'll provide written statements about this incident within the hour." As Rodriguez moved to follow her orders, Sarah pulled out her phone, stopping the recording. "And Miller, the next time you decide to profile someone as a threat based on their appearance, remember this moment. Remember how your assumptions and prejudices led you to point your weapon at your chief of police." Miller's face flushed red as Rodriguez took his weapon. The other officers watched in stunned silence as their colleague was led away, his career effectively over by his own actions. Sarah turned to address the remaining officers. "Let me be very clear," she said, making eye contact with each of them. "What happened here tonight is exactly why I'm conducting these inspections. This department has a cancer of prejudice and poor judgment that needs to be cut out. Those who can't or won't adapt to proper, professional, unbiased policing will find themselves looking for new jobs." She straightened her blazer, her badge catching the light one more time. "I expect those statements on my desk within the hour. And spread the word. Changes aren't coming to this department. They're already here." As she watched the officers hurry inside, Sarah took a deep breath. The night had turned out very differently than she planned, but maybe this was exactly what the department needed. A clear example that the old ways of doing things were over. Inside her office, Sarah Thompson sat at her desk, the events of the night still fresh in her mind. The clock on the wall showed 3:45 a.m., but sleep was the last thing on her mind. In front of her lay 3 hastily written statements from Officers Johnson and Peters, along with Sergeant Rodriguez's initial incident report. Her phone sat in the middle of the desk, the recorded audio from the confrontation already backed up to 3 separate secure locations. Sarah had learned long ago the importance of protecting evidence, especially in cases involving officer misconduct. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, looking up to see Captain Michael Rodriguez enter, his face showing the strain of the night's events. "Chief," he said, closing the door behind him, "Miller's been processed. His weapon, badge, and equipment are secured in evidence." He sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. "He's demanding to speak with his union representative." Sarah nodded, having expected this. "He has that right. But so do I have the right to suspend him immediately under department policy when an officer threatens deadly force against a superior. She picked up her phone, playing a short clip of the recorded confrontation. Miller's voice, harsh and prejudiced, filled the room. Rodriguez winced at the playback. "It's worse when you hear it again," he admitted. "The other officers are talking. This isn't the first time Miller's drawn his weapon without proper cause, but it's the first time he's been caught so clearly." Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "Tell me more about these other incidents, Captain, and tell me why they weren't in his file when I reviewed it last week." The captain shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The old administration, they had a way of handling things quietly. Complaints would vanish, reports would get lost in the system, especially if the complaints came from certain neighborhoods or involved certain officers. "Like Miller," Sarah said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, Chief. Miller and a few others. They've been here so long, they thought they were untouchable." Rodriguez paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Some officers are saying you set him up tonight." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "By what?" "Being black in my own parking lot. By doing my job as chief and inspecting my department." Her voice remained calm, but carried an edge of steel. "The only thing that set up Officer Miller was his own prejudice and poor judgment." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the now quiet parking lot where the incident had occurred. "Captain, I want every complaint filed against Miller for the past 5 years. Every traffic stop, every use of force report, every citizen interaction. If they've been lost, find them. If they've been buried, dig them up." "That's going to make waves, Chief," Rodriguez warned. "Miller has friends in the department, supporters on the city council." Sarah turned back to face him. "Let them make waves. I'd rather weather a storm doing what's right than sail smoothly doing what's wrong." She returned to her desk and opened her laptop. "And while you're at it, I want the same information for every officer who's had complaints disappear under the old administration." Rodriguez stood, recognizing the dismissal in her tone. "Yes, Chief. I'll get started right away." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, a lot of officers are glad you're here. What happened tonight? It needed to happen." After he left, Sarah began typing her own report of the incident. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she documented every detail: the improper weapon draw, the discriminatory language, the failure to follow identification protocols. This report wouldn't disappear like the others. Her phone buzzed with a text message from the mayor. "Emergency meeting, 9 a.m. Bring all documentation." Sarah smiled grimly. She had expected this too. The old guard would try to protect their own, but they'd never faced someone like her before. She had truth, evidence, and 20 years of experience dealing with people who underestimated her. As she continued working, the first hints of dawn began to color the sky. Change was coming to the Millbrook Police Department, whether they were ready for it or not. And Sarah Thompson was just getting started. At exactly 9 a.m., Sarah Thompson walked into the mayor's conference room with a thick folder under her arm and her phone containing the damning audio recording. She had changed into her formal uniform, every button polished, every crease sharp. 5 hours had passed since the incident, but she looked as fresh and determined as ever. Mayor Richardson sat at the head of the long table, his face tight with concern. To his right sat 3 city council members, and to his left was the police union representative, Mark Davis. Officer Miller sat at the far end, now in civilian clothes, with his union-appointed lawyer beside him. "Chief Thompson," the mayor began, his voice carefully neutral, "we've called this meeting to discuss the incident that occurred early this morning. Officer Miller has raised some serious concerns about your methods of inspection." Sarah placed her folder on the table and sat down calmly. "With all due respect, Mayor, I believe Officer Miller's actions early this morning raise far more serious concerns." She opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "But before we discuss that, I have some other matters to share." Miller's lawyer leaned forward. "My client maintains that he was following standard procedure for an unidentified person in a restricted area." "Unidentified?" Sarah's voice was cool as she pulled out her phone. "Let's review what actually happened." She pressed play, and the recording filled the room. Everyone heard Miller's aggressive commands, her clear identification as chief, and his continued threats despite knowing who she was. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the recording played. When it finished, Sarah continued, "But this isn't just about last night." She started laying out documents on the table. In the past 5 years, Officer Miller has had 27 complaints filed against him. 15 of those mysteriously vanished from our systems. 12 involved excessive force against minority citizens. Those complaints were investigated and dismissed. The union rep interrupted. "Were they?" Sarah pulled out more papers. "Because I have here signed statements from 3 former department employees about how they were instructed to lose certain complaints. I also have data showing that Miller's traffic stops involved minority drivers 85% of the time, despite our city's demographic makeup being only 30% minority residents." Mayor Richardson's face had grown increasingly pale. "Chief Thompson, are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mayor. I'm stating facts." Sarah's voice remained professional but firm. Officer Miller's actions last night weren't a mistake or a misunderstanding. They were the culmination of years of unchecked bias and abuse of power. Miller suddenly stood up, his face red with anger. "This is a witch hunt. She's trying to destroy my career because of her own agenda." "Sit down, Officer Miller," Sarah commanded, her voice cutting through his outburst. "Your career was destroyed the moment you decided to point your weapon at your chief of police because you saw a black woman in a parking lot and assumed she didn't belong there." The room fell silent. The council members exchanged worried glances. Furthermore, Sarah continued, pulling out more documents, "I have here evidence of similar patterns of behavior from 6 other officers in our department. This isn't about one incident or one officer. This is about a systemic problem that has been ignored for far too long." The mayor rubbed his temples. "What are you proposing, Chief?" "Officer Miller's immediate termination, for starters. A complete external review of our department's complaint system. Mandatory bias training for all officers, and the establishment of a civilian oversight committee." She laid out each point with precise clarity. "And if anyone in this room has a problem with these changes, I'm happy to share all of this information with the State Oversight Board and the media." The union representative started to object, but the mayor held up his hand. He looked at Sarah with a mix of respect and resignation. "I believe we need to take a short recess to discuss these proposals." As the others filed out of the room, Miller remained seated, staring at the table. Sarah gathered her documents, then paused beside him. "You had a choice every day you put on that badge," she said quietly. "You chose wrong. Now you face the consequences." The news of Officer Miller's termination spread through the Millbrook Police Department like wildfire. By afternoon, every officer, dispatcher, and staff member knew the details. Sarah Thompson sat in her office, watching through her window as small groups of officers gathered in the parking lot, talking in hushed tones. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the morning meeting ended. Local news reporters wanted statements. City council members were calling to pledge their support, now that they saw which way the wind was blowing. Even the state police commissioner had called to discuss her evidence of departmental misconduct. A knock on her door drew her attention. "Come in," she called, turning away from the window. Captain Rodriguez entered, followed by Officer Lisa Chen, one of the younger officers on the force. Chen looked nervous but determined. "Chief," Rodriguez said, "Officer Chen has something she needs to share with you." Sarah gestured for them to sit. Chen clutched a manila envelope in her hands, her knuckles white with tension. "It's okay, Officer Chen," Sarah said gently. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." Chen took a deep breath. "After what happened with Miller, I need to show you these." She opened the envelope and pulled out several papers. 3 months ago, I tried to report Miller and Officers Thompson and Garcia for what I saw during a traffic stop. They planted evidence in a black teenager's car. Sarah's face remained calm, but her eyes flashed with anger. "What happened to your report?" "The old captain told me to forget about it. Said I was too new to understand how things worked." Chen's voice grew stronger. "They threatened to make my life difficult if I pushed it. Said no one would believe me over 3 senior officers." Sarah picked up her desk phone. "Give me the date and details of that traffic stop." As Chen talked, Sarah dialed a number. "This is Chief Thompson. I need all body camera footage from March 15th. Officers Miller, Thompson, and Garcia, traffic stop on Pine Street." She paused, listening. Yes, I know it was marked as corrupted. Find it anyway. Rodriguez shifted in his chair. Chief, if Chen is right about Thompson and Garcia, then they'll face the same consequences as Miller. Sarah finished firmly. She turned to Chen. Thank you for coming forward, Officer Chen. I know it wasn't easy. From now on, any reports of misconduct come directly to me or Captain Rodriguez. Chen nodded, sitting straighter in her chair. There's more, Chief. Other officers have similar stories. They've been afraid to speak up, but after this morning, they're ready to talk now, Sarah concluded. She pulled out a legal pad. Start from the beginning. I want every detail you can remember. For the next hour, Chen shared story after story of misconduct, abuse of power, and covered-up incidents. Sarah took detailed notes, occasionally asking Rodriguez to pull specific files or records. As Chen finished, Sarah stood up. Officer Chen, I want you to know that things are different now. No more covered-up reports. No more threats against officers who do the right thing. A commotion outside caught their attention. Through the window, they could see Garcia and Thompson storming toward the building, their faces dark with anger. Word had clearly reached them about Chen's revelations. Captain, Sarah said calmly, please escort Officer Chen out through the back entrance. Then send Officers Williams and Martinez to meet our angry colleagues in the lobby. After they left, Sarah opened her laptop and began typing. The evidence from Miller's incident had cracked open the wall of silence. Now, the real work of cleaning up the department could begin. Her email inbox pinged with a new message from the mayor. Press conference tomorrow, 9 a.m. City needs to hear from you directly about changes in the department. Sarah smiled grimly. She'd been preparing for this moment her entire career. Tomorrow, she would lay out her vision for a reformed police department, one that truly served and protected all citizens equally. A text message lit up her phone from an unknown number. Thank you for believing me, Chief. More officers want to talk. We're ready for change. Looking out at the setting sun, Sarah felt a mix of determination and hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, real change felt possible in the Millbrook Police Department. The City Hall steps were packed with reporters, cameras, and curious citizens by 8:45 a.m. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching into the clear morning sky. The story of a police chief held at gunpoint by her own officer had spread far beyond Millbrook's borders, attracting national media attention. Inside the building, Sarah Thompson reviewed her notes one final time. She had chosen to wear her formal uniform, every medal and commendation in place. Each one represented a milestone in her career, leading to this moment. 5 minutes, Chief, Captain Rodriguez said, entering the preparation room. The mayor's already at the podium, giving his introduction. Sarah nodded, standing up and straightening her uniform. How's the crowd outside? Growing bigger by the minute. Channel 7 is broadcasting live. And Chief. Rodriguez paused. Miller's supporters are out there too. About 20 officers in civilian clothes, along with some of their friends. Let them watch, Sarah said firmly. What happens next needs witnesses. As she walked toward the main entrance, other officers lined the hallway. Some nodded in respect, while others looked away. The department was still divided, but the sides were shifting. More officers had come forward overnight with their own stories of misconduct they'd witnessed. The mayor's voice drifted in from outside. And now, I present Chief Sarah Thompson, who will address recent events in our police department. Sarah stepped into the bright sunlight, the cameras clicking rapidly. She approached the podium with measured steps, her posture straight and confident. In the crowd, she spotted Miller's supporters clustered together, their faces hostile. But behind them stood Officer Chen and several other young officers, their presence a silent show of support. Good morning, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. 2 nights ago, I was held at gunpoint in the parking lot of my own police station. Not by a criminal, but by one of our officers. This incident has raised serious questions about our department's culture and practices. She paused, letting her words sink in. Some have asked why I conducted a late-night inspection in civilian clothes. The answer is simple. I needed to see the true face of our department, not the one that gets put on display when the chief is expected. In the crowd, A reporter raised his hand. Chief Thompson, is it true that Officer Miller had previous complaints against him? Yes, Sarah replied without hesitation, and those complaints were systematically buried or ignored. But this isn't just about one officer. Our investigation has revealed a pattern of misconduct involving several officers, all of whom are now suspended pending further investigation. A murmur ran through the crowd. Near the back, some of Miller's supporters started to leave. As of this morning, Sarah continued, I am implementing comprehensive reforms in our department. These include mandatory bias training, a new civilian oversight committee, and a complete review of all dismissed complaints from the past 5 years. Another reporter called out, What about the officers who say you're targeting them unfairly? Sarah's gaze swept across the crowd. Justice isn't unfair. Accountability isn't unfair. What's unfair is having one set of rules for some officers and another for everyone else. That ends today. She pulled out a document from her folder. I'm announcing the creation of an anonymous reporting system for both officers and citizens to report misconduct. No more buried complaints. No more lost evidence. No more silence in the face of wrongdoing. In the front row, an elderly black woman stood up. Sarah recognized her from one of the buried complaint files, Mrs. Jackson, whose grandson had been wrongly arrested by Miller last year. Chief Thompson, Mrs. Jackson said, her voice shaking with emotion, will there be justice for those of us who were wronged in the past? Sarah stepped out from behind the podium, looking directly at Mrs. Jackson. Yes, ma'am. Every dismissed complaint will be reviewed. Every case of misconduct will be investigated. I cannot undo the past, but I can promise you this. Under my leadership, every citizen of Millbrook will be treated with equal respect and dignity under the law. The crowd erupted in applause, drowning out the grumbling of Miller's remaining supporters. As Sarah returned to the podium, she could feel the momentum of change building. The hard work was just beginning, but for the first time, the path forward was clear. 3 months had passed since the night Officer Miller pointed his gun at Chief Sarah Thompson. The Millbrook Police Department looked very different now. The old guard had largely departed, some retired, others resigned, and a few were fired after investigations revealed their misconduct. In their place, a new generation of officers was rising, trained under Sarah's reformed policies. On this sunny morning, Sarah stood in the department's newly renovated training room. The walls, once bare, now displayed the department's new mission statement: to protect and serve. Equally, fairly, always. Below it hung photos of community outreach events and newspaper clippings about the department's transformation. Chief, Officer Lisa Chen called from the doorway. They're ready for you in the community center. Sarah nodded, gathering her materials. Today marked the launch of the Millbrook Citizens Police Advisory Board, a diverse group of community members who would help oversee department policies and handle complaints. It was another step in rebuilding trust between the police and the community. As they drove to the community center, Sarah noticed positive changes in the streets. Officers were out of their cars more, talking with residents. Shop owners waved at passing patrol cars instead of watching them suspiciously. Children played freely in parks where they once hurried home at the sight of police. It's different now, Chen said, noticing Sarah's observations. People trust us more. Last week, Mrs. Rodriguez from the Latino Community Center actually called us for help with a youth program. Said she never would have done that 6 months ago. The community center parking lot was full when they arrived. Inside, the meeting room was packed with faces representing every part of Millbrook's diverse population. Sarah recognized many of them: business owners, religious leaders, activists, and even some former critics of the department. Among them sat Mrs. Jackson, the elderly woman from the press conference. She now headed the Civilian Oversight Committee, turning her years of activism into practical change. Next to her was James Miller Jr., the teenager who had been wrongly arrested last year. Now he was studying criminal justice in college, inspired by the changes he'd seen. Sarah took her place at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd. 3 months ago, she began, our department stood at a crossroads. We could continue down the old path of bias and secrecy, or we could choose a new direction. Thanks to all of you, we chose change. She gestured to a screen behind her, where statistics were displayed. Civilian complaints are down 60%. Use of force incidents have decreased by 70%, but more importantly, Successful crime prevention and community assistance cases have increased by 45%. We're not just policing less aggressively, we're policing more effectively. From the back of the room, a familiar face caught her attention. It was Officer Miller's daughter, Emma. She had reached out to Sarah last month, wanting to apologize for her father's actions and share her own story of struggling with his prejudices. Now she was helping with the department's youth outreach program. Today, we're not just launching an advisory board, Sarah continued. We're continuing a partnership between police and community. Every person in this room has a voice in how their community is protected. Every concern will be heard. Every suggestion will be considered. After the presentation, as people mingled and signed up for various committees, Mrs. Jackson approached Sarah. "Chief Thompson," she said, her eyes moist, "my grandson just got accepted into the police academy. Says he wants to be part of the change. Never thought I'd be proud to see him become an officer, but here we are." Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey to this moment. The night Miller pointed his gun at her had been a turning point, not just for her but for the entire community. What could have been a tragedy had instead become a catalyst for real change. As the sun set over Millbrook that evening, Sarah stood in the police station parking lot where it all began. New officers were arriving for the night shift, while day shift officers headed home. Each one greeted her with genuine respect, not out of fear or obligation, but because they shared her vision for what policing could be. The department's transformation wasn't complete, and there would always be more work to do. But looking at the positive changes around her, Sarah Thompson knew that sometimes the biggest changes started with one person willing to stand up and say, "This stops here."